JavaScript has made some really radical changes in the year 2015. ECMA 6 is the new standard, basically, for JavaScript. It doesn't mean that you need to throw everything out the door, but it does introduce a lot of nice new features, and I'm going to cover some of those today. Some of you guys will and girls will like this because I think JavaScript is almost converging to some of the niceties of more classical, object-oriented languages like Ruby. So I'm going to get into that in just a second. So what is ECMA 6? It's just a versioning of JavaScript. It's decided by a panel of people, essentially. And in my opinion, it's the most significant improvement to the language since its creation. Ken likes to talk about the creation of JavaScript being done within 3 days. I've heard similar stories, but the reason why I want to focus on this actually is partly I've been trying to be an advocate a little bit of JavaScript within the program. I love Ruby on Rails, I love Ruby, but I also see the true value of having some chops in both languages. So one thing I do appreciate is previous versions of JavaScript did not have classes at all, so it made object-oriented programming a nightmare. And hopefully everyone understands what that means. It introduces some really key features that are really nice that should be familiar to anyone that has been working with Ruby for a little bit, like modules, symbols, and something fancy called promises that has been a lot of rage. I mean, a lot of excitement going on about that. I'm not going to be talking about them a lot today just because they're a more advanced JavaScript topic, and I could cover that in like 20 minutes on another talk. So one thing that's nice that even Ken asked me is how can we use, is it practical to use ECMA 6 today? Some people call it JavaScript 2015, by the way. Is it practical to use this new version of JavaScript today? Because there's always issues with browser support and such. So the nice thing is it's completely backwards compatible with ECMA 5, which was released in 2009. So you don't have to run into any issues coding this way today. It basically will be compiled into ECMA 5, which is, again, just a standard. And a good resource to check this out is a website called babbeljs.io. It's a good introduction. If you guys want to check it out later, it's a good introduction to some of the major changes that have happened in this new versioning. So this is basically, if you ask Ken ever what he thinks of JavaScript, he usually goes into a 5-minute rant. But I think he's sort of changed his mind after I've talked to him a little bit about it. So my first thing is, I tend to not like to use too many words. I like to use a good example. So JavaScript used to have this notion called prototypical inheritance. It's pretty much the only language I know of that actually had structure this way, and I'm not sure of the history behind it, but most people have decided in the year 2015 it makes no sense because it doesn't really mimic other languages at all. It's too much of an outlier, and it doesn't really promote further learning of JavaScript from other languages. So the nice thing is that we, the people who are working with JavaScript, inventing it essentially, said we should just take the idea of classes and essentially implement them in JavaScript because that's what everyone else is using. So as we can see here, skinny mesh, there's a couple key factors here. So the extend keyword is basically using, it's like a mix-it in Ruby essentially. So it is mixing in a module called 3mesh. And what's going on here? So there's a couple of concepts I wanted to cover that isn't very familiar with maybe people more traditionally just focused on Ruby. Super is a definition. It's a keyword, and it looks up to the function functions are just methods, basically, in JavaScript. And it looks up to the parent class function of the same, the thing that is underneath. So, for example, when it says super geometry and material, it is looking up to the parent class of skinny mesh, which in this case would be 3mesh. So it's a way of doing, basically inheriting properties from the parent class. And everything else in the constructor is just how JavaScript constructs objects, essentially. So just like in Ruby, we have this idea of initialize, right? In JavaScript, you use this dot bones, for example, equals an empty array. And this is how you would initialize this new object, essentially. So again, the object being skinny mesh. And of course, we have our methods or functions on the object or function, however you want to call it. Update, again, is using the super keyword. And all that's saying is, let's look up to the parent class and use that definition of update within our update. So it's sort of a nice way of keeping code, quote unquote, dry. Don't repeat yourself. You know, there's no need to reinvent the wheel if we already have it somewhere on the chain of inheritance. So this is one of the really key big benefits of ECMA 6, and how I use it day to day is this is one of the key ways of using it, because it's just a lot easier to use than prototypical inheritance, in my opinion. So another really nice thing is JavaScript can be really weird and stubborn in the sense that it doesn't follow the standards of a lot of other coding languages. Where languages like Ruby have scoping in blocks, JavaScript until ECMA 6 did not have scoping in blocks. It had functional scoping. This could be a nightmare, because then you'd see functions within functions within functions, and then you'd have basically all these callback functions, and it could be just really difficult to read things when basically this solution gets rid of all that problems and uses a keyword called let. And all let does is it scopes variables or functions to the block. So in this example, we have a function called f, and then we scope x, so only block scope name. So why do we get an error here? So we see, no, sorry. So basically, let is a way of implementing block scoping, and it's useful because, again, like languages like Ruby, it's just more intuitive. I think functional scoping can get really messy, and it can be hard to read. So it's just another thing that makes it more intuitive coming from other languages that have that block scoping mechanism already in place. Okay, so another key feature that I really want to touch upon is just the idea of modularity. In Ruby, this is basically, well, you do have modules in Ruby, but you usually use mixins to mix in a module into another file, for example. This is really key because JavaScript files tend to be really bulky and after a while not very organized. You want to talk, you know, there was a previous talk given about readability of code. JavaScript can be notorious for being unreadable because people don't know how to organize the code. But this is nice because you can break things into parts. So as you can imagine, you can structure your code based off of certain functions. Say, you know, all your math functions, you would keep that in a namespace of a module of math.js. And if I want to import that, what's going on in the second box here is saying, I'm going to import the star selector is just basically everything. Okay, so as an object called math from this directory, from the library math directory. And we're basically now saying we are basically can use the math as the object, and then we can call upon the function sum within other files of the of an app, essentially. So so we import everything. The star selector is just everything as an object math from the file library. Another way of doing it, I just wanted to include it, is you can specify which variables and which functions you want to import just through a hash, essentially. So that's an alternative way. And then you don't have to declare math.sum. You can just declare sum of the function, essentially. So this is really neat because I use this all the time when building Ember apps. It makes the code a lot more readable. I can't emphasize how much of a nightmare it is to go through thousands of lines of codes. And even if there's commenting, it can still be very unstructured, very unwieldy, in the sense that it's all hairy-carry. Some of the stuff is unorganized. The code is rarely blocked together in places that make sense. So this makes it a lot nicer and easier. Okay, so super inheritance. I got to this a little bit earlier, but I wanted to cover it one more time. So we have a simple example of a class called Polygon. And I think this will be intuitive for everyone because it's just basic math, right? We have a polygon and we have a constructor. And this is just exactly like the initialize method in Ruby, right? So we're saying this.name is polygon, this.height is height, this.width is width. Pretty boring. All right. But down here, we introduce a child class called square that inherits from polygon. Essentially, extend means you're inheriting from polygon. It's just like the arrow key when you're doing inheritance in Ruby. So what's interesting here is you would think intuitively that you could call this.height if you're inheriting all the properties from polygon, because this.height is defined in the constructor. But that is not the case. You have to first call the super and pass in the length parameter into basically the super constructor. So super references the constructor of the polygon and then passes in the length twice for height and width. So basically that will then construct our polygon, and then we can call this the height after it. So it's really important in JavaScript, these new class-based inheritance. It's really important that you call the super function before you try to access any of the properties. Otherwise, it just won't work. But as you can see in the function get area, we finally have access to this.height and this.width because we applied the super keyword beforehand. Okay, so this last topic I am very hesitant to go over because it is quite advanced, but I just wanted to introduce it because it is partly why ECMA 6 is being touted as a huge update to the JavaScript world. It's something I'm getting used to right now. But this idea of asynchronous programming, it's a complicated idea, but I tried to find the simplest example in programming, and the simplest example is obviously Hello World, right? We all know Hello World. It's sort of the butt joke of all programming languages. If you can't do Hello World, then you're probably in the wrong area. But so what is going on in this code? So let's first talk about what a promise is. A promise can represent a failure or success. So what is cool about this is if the network goes down or something like that, and the greeting can't be fetched from the web service, you can then register an error essentially as a second argument to the promise. So this is using these things called callback methods. What's going on here, we have a say hello function that is set equal, or not set equal, is assigned to greeting promises variable. Greeting promises, when you use .then, that basically indicates it's a promise. And then we pass in two callback functions. A callback function is just an anonymous function that it's like a lambda essentially. It's an anonymous function that you pass into as a parameter essentially. Feel free to ask me questions about this afterwards. So we pass in two arguments. We have the success argument, and then we have the error argument. So we're saying if it's successful, then we're going to console.log the greeting, which is going to be hello world in this case. But if it's the error, we are going to say, oh no, something bad happened. So this is really helpful because promises allow you to handle this dual relationship without it's sort of, not only does it slim down the amount of code you have to do, but it also handles error exceptions. And from what I gather, it allows you to do asynchronous programming, which I guess the best way of describing asynchronous programming would be the fact that you don't have to do things in order. So we oftentimes think of execution being in order and all the steps being completed step by step. But asynchronous programming can do things. You can pause it, you can start it, and it's pretty useful. It's definitely a powerful tool. So this is just a brief introduction to ECMA 6. There are quite a few changes. These are the ones that interest me the most. I like to build Ember apps on top of Rails. This sort of what got me into it, and Ember.js is a framework, just like Rails is a framework for Ruby. And it's pretty standard to use ECMA 6 in Ember apps these days. So I wanted to introduce this to everyone, partially because it is the cutting edge, but it's become, it's not too cutting edge because it's becoming standardized in 2015. So it's good to know. And I wanted to share some other resources. I'm no expert on ECMA 6 by any means. I use the most basic of basic uses. I primarily use the modularity idea of modules and classes that carries a lot of weight, and you can get a lot done with that. But here are some decent resources I found that were good to read up on. There's this website called tuality.com. Not only is it a good website about ECMA 6, but it is also just a strong website and blog in general about JavaScript and best practices. So I highly recommend everyone check that out. Another invaluable resource I find is the Mozilla Developer Network, and this is just an encyclopedia of JavaScript knowledge. You can search for things. It's fairly comprehensive, and examples are ready for you, and people are constantly, it's open source, so people contribute to it and try to make it the most intuitive and easy to understand as possible. And I wanted to say the last thing is I'm still learning ECMA 6, so I'm feel free to talk to me about it because I'm going to be needing to use it professionally now, and I want to encourage people to get into JavaScript a little bit if they can. I think it's a powerful language. Obviously, it's the language of the browser. It is essential to a lot of web development these days. And cool things is like, I feel like in my experience, I graduated from Firehose last month, and I feel a lot of my Ruby foundations carry over, because once you learn strong practices in object-oriented programming, it really carries over to pretty much any languages. This whole idea of inheritance, using the super keyword, all these things are familiar concepts in a lot of different languages. So what is really important is you build a foundation, and then learning that second language, like JavaScript, after you learn Ruby pretty well, is quite easy, because you start seeing similar patterns, and you start realizing that you're not totally reinventing the wheel here. It's just a different way, different syntax. So I guess I would like to encourage everyone to take a look at JavaScript. I would love to talk to you about more JavaScript topics in the future. I plan on keep on building a blog. I'm starting on Medium to talk about issues I had while learning JavaScript, coming from a Ruby background. And I guess I am open to questions now, if that's okay. So yeah.
Solid stuff. From what you showed us about like this ECMA Script 6, like it looks like it's a huge improvement over the standard, the past way. I think the syntax is much better, and it feels good that we're not going to have to suffer through the mistakes of the past. I think this is actually really cool stuff.
It's important, because I think there was an acknowledgement that JavaScript was becoming too isolated from other languages, but JavaScript is so integral to the web that people should be encouraged to learn it, not discouraged to learn it. So I think they tried to really not converge all the way, but tried to make life easier for people coming from other languages to learn JavaScript. Yeah.
Good stuff. Does anybody have any questions for Chris?
So I do. It's basically kind of a more generic question about JavaScript, because it's not something I've been. I mean, I haven't been doing a lot of it.
Yeah, of course.
So is this because it kind of said in the sheet that sort of like it's going to be like replacing JavaScript altogether. So is this like it's not kind of like an evolution of it, or is it?
It's not replacing. It's I like to think of it as a versioning. So Ruby has versions that are released. They release usually by 0.1, 0.2. Like 2.1, 2.2, et cetera, et cetera. Big releases obviously are single digits. So 3 might be coming out in a couple of years or something like that. This is just a standard. It's not a new language. It's an extension of the language. It's like a superset of the language. So all the fundamentals, if you're trying to learn JavaScript, if you're watching the videos that Ken made, that still applies. And I don't want to make it sound like those are not important. They are incredibly important, just like any language, For example, like Ruby got rid of hash rockets. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but they're deprecated now. And I think Ruby 2.2, I believe. But that doesn't mean it's like bad to use them. It's just like they just might like fall out of fashion later on. The way I see things is this is an extension of JavaScript. It's expanding the language. It's making things more expressive. And particularly, it's making the language easier, because it's smoothing out some of the quirks that made JavaScript so annoying to people coming to the language.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I guess when I see there's like lots of, looks like different flavors or versions of JavaScript, and I didn't know if this was another thing or, and then you got the server side stuff, and I'm still new to that. So
I don't use Node. So I'm not the person to talk to. I use JavaScript purely on the front end.
Okay.
But I do use Rails as a backend for my applications that I build sometimes with JavaScript. So there's tons of good resources I could point you to later on in terms of learning JavaScript. It has a reputation of not being too bad, especially coming from a language like Ruby. So I'd be happy to do that later on.
Yeah, I would love that.
Yeah.
Thank you, because I kind of feel like that's the next thing I got to dive into.
Well, yeah, I always say, like, more so than anything, I think it's important. I don't have a mastery on anything. You don't really master a language necessarily, but you want to go deep dive. And I think that's one thing that's awesome about this program. It really promotes that sense of deep learning in a short period of time. You want to dive deep into the Ruby language, try to read as many books as you can in your spare time. And again, I can tip you off on some ones that I really liked. Don't pick up another language, I guess what I'm saying, until you feel quite good about Ruby, and then it's just a matter of syntax and some other minor quirks that you can learn in literally a month, so.
Cool. Wow.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
So, any other questions for Chris?
So I have one. Not real sharp with JavaScript, but I know that there's a lot of different languages out there, like React.js, and you mentioned Node. How does ECMA compare to those, like, usability-wise?
Yeah, so again, those are more, I like to use the analogy of, like, Rails is a framework, but it's built on Ruby. Node is just a server framework built in JS or JavaScript. So, and React, while I don't have very much experience with it, it's another front-end framework that's built in JS. So these frameworks are supposed to be tools. Sometimes they feel like they're another language just because of how complicated things have gotten lately. But they're supposed to be tools, once you learn them, to speed up the process of web development, building these ambitious apps that are largely seamless. So basically the important thing to understand is, like, you can't really do Rails without, well, some people say you can, but you can't really do Rails without knowing Ruby. I mean, you can't write good models, methods and models. You can't do the chess app. You can't do anything like that without knowing some Ruby, and it's just flat out essential. And the more ambitious you want to build your app, the more you probably need to know the foundations. The same is true with JavaScript. You start with the foundations, and then you start realizing, oh, okay, yes, I'm using JavaScript, but I'm really just building functions, whether I'm in Node, whether I'm in React, or whether I'm building an Ember app. I'm still, ultimately tossing around variables, using functions, which are just methods, essentially. It's really just, it's all built off of the foundations, I should say. Does that make sense?
Yep, completely. Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else? Did I bore everyone? Yeah. I guess not.
Well, it was a super good talk, Chris. Really super deep into the technical. I think everybody probably.
Yeah, I don't even know if this was the right talk to do. I probably should have done the why JavaScript talk before going into all the new stuff.
An anti-Ken rant.
Well, no, it's not. It's really, my philosophy is, like, JavaScript is not my favorite language, but it's so used on the web that it's important to know.
Yeah,
it's like learning CSS without learning HTML. It just doesn't make sense, right? So I think these things are good to have in your tool belt. It's certainly marketable, obviously, but it's not as hard to pick up as people make it out to be once you got that first language down. So, when in my experience in the program, I was starting to learn JavaScript midway through the program, and now I use it in my job that I just started yesterday. But you know, I'm building Ember apps in JavaScript, so it's definitely doable. I mean, that's a span of probably 4 months I was dedicating to JavaScript, along with Ruby, along with Rails, and I was doing all of them in tandem, sort of. But again, you're not reinventing the wheel. A lot of the topics are similar. Functions are like methods. You pass in parameters just like a method. You know, you have to use a semicolon, but like, boo-hoo, that's not too bad, right? You know, so it's just, there's certain like syntactical changes here and there, but the more complicated stuff I hope to further illuminate in my blog, and I also hope to just be sort of a guidance for people that want to learn JavaScript just on like the Slack channel or just want to talk to me in general. But there's a lot of good resources out there, and I hope you definitely take a chance. Just take a chance with JavaScript. I think it's a good language to learn.
Good stuff.
Take a chance with JavaScript.
Well, cool. We had a bunch of good talks today, so thanks so much to everybody who gave one. Chris, your talk was really excellent, and I think it just like really shed a lot of light on the latest cutting edge of JavaScript. So